Okay, so this is video 2 for my day off on February 21st. The other critic of the New Deal was the conservative critic of the New Deal was the Supreme Court. So FDR had two branches pretty much on lockdown, which would be the executive and legislative branch. But one branch he didn't really at first was the judicial branch. So these guys were the most conservative critics, or the ones that had the biggest threat to FDR in general from the conservative side. And it proved very frustrating to FDR. After 2 years of making the New Deal, the Supreme Court will hear several cases and declare the NRA and the AAA unconstitutional by 1935. So 2 years into the New Deal, NRA and the AAA get declared unconstitutional. So FDR is worried this will continue as a trend. Like basically there will be more and more programs that will be brought to court, and that one by one all these New Deal programs will be struck down. And so he sees the judicial branch as a big threat or a big problem to his agenda. Anyway, so after winning a landslide victory in 1936, FDR feels compelled to go ahead and push through a new piece of legislation that would help him get more influence over the judicial branch. So early on in 1937, you're going to see him propose what's called a court reorganization plan to Congress, often commonly referred to as the court packing bill. And you'll see that on test, and you can call it a court packing bill in an essay too. So in early 1937, FDR proposes to Congress this court packing bill where essentially every federal judge in the U.S. that's 70 years or older would get an assistant judge to help with their caseload because they're older. So since he's the president, obviously he gets to appoint all these judges. At the time, of the 9 Supreme Court justices, 6 of them were 70 years or older, which means that FDR would add 6 more justices to the Supreme Court, making the number up to 15. And of course, obviously, you can guess what would happen then. Like all these judges across the nation would be obviously pro-New Deal judges. So he basically stocked the court up with a bunch of New Deal type New Deal judges, essentially. You can see here that kind of show, I don't know how well you can see it, but in this picture, you have like the regular 9 Supreme Court justices, and behind them you have like 6 FDR heads, and FDR down here trying to like persuade people to put these guys back there. So anyway, and obviously to make the courts more liberal in general. So Republicans and Democrats were outraged over FDR's blatant attempt to try to temper with checks and balances. Like basically, this is FDR becoming a little bit tyrannical, trying to circumvent the court and having too much power over the court. Because, I mean, constitutionally he could do this because there's no limitation on how many judges he can appoint. But it's obvious to both Republicans and Democrats that this is a power grab, and he's trying to act a bit like a dictator almost. So for the first time under FDR, Congress will reject a piece of legislation that comes from FDR. So after all those New Deal programs that FDR suggested to Congress, this is the first time that Congress will say no, both Democrats and Republicans. And after this all goes down, the Supreme Court does back off and kind of get scared of what FDR tries to do to them, or at least what he could do to them. And so they do kind of back off, and they'll later uphold Social Security and the Wagner Act. So whenever there's court cases that come up before the court dealing with Social Security and the Wagner Act, they'll actually uphold them. And then just by natural happenstance, in his second term, FDR is going to end up appointing, I think, two or three judges, and then FDR is going to, of course, have a third term where he's going to appoint at least one more judge. So naturally, over time, FDR will have the Supreme Court have retirees, people who will leave office, and so FDR is able to put, I believe, 3 or 4 judges on the court by the time he leaves office in the mid-40s. So anyway, the court became more liberal over time anyway. So that's the critics of the New Deal. Now we're going to look at kind of the back end of the New Deal, kind of the last few years of this and how it kind of wraps up. So acts like the NRA and the Wagner Act had lasting effects of legalizing unions. And so membership in the 1930s shot back up finally after they went on a drought in the 1920s. So by 1941, you have over 10 million people in unions. So unions become stronger in the 1930s because of things like the NRA and the Wagner Act, and membership shoots up to about 10 million by 1941. So The biggest union of the 1930s was the AFL, the one we talked about from the 1880s, the American Federation of Labor. So it's been around for quite a long time. AFL is still around today in 2018. But because it's adding more people and getting larger, you're seeing different ideas about how the union should operate. The AFL at this point was mostly dominated by skilled white male workers, and they were organized by craft. So the biggest national union, the AFL, mostly was dominated by white skilled workers and they organized themselves based on their craft. So like you had to be a painter, you had to be like a some kind of mechanic or whatever the case is, but you had to have a craft, and that's how people got organized. Some people in the AFL wanted to expand this to all workers, not just to skilled white workers, and also not just the males. And so there's growing tensions that are developing here in this national union by the mid-30s. And so a subcommittee formed within the AFL called the Committee of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. So at first it forms as a committee, a subcommittee of AFL, Committee of Industrial Organizations. It's led by a union leader named John Lewis. John Lewis was a mine union organizer, and so he helps us develop this, the CIO, to kind of help develop other types of workers within the AFL. He's interested in basically organizing anybody. He's interested in organizing, unskilled workers, workers based on their industry, not based on their craft, hence like mine workers, women. It could be based on, regardless of race, whatever the case is. And so after about a year or so, the AFL and the CIO began to have tension and clash, and so the CIO broke off. And so in 1936, the CIO breaks off away from the AFL and creates its own separate union called now the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So they go from being committee to now being the Congress of Industrial Organizations. So the CIO becomes now a break-off rival national union to the AFL. So the AFL still is white male skilled workers based on their craft. The CIO that forms will now be all workers can join it, regardless of their skill, race, gender, and so they'll take skilled and unskilled, doesn't matter. And so now AFL and CIO become the two biggest competing unions in the country, and this will be the case until the 1950s, where eventually they reunite. So in the 1950s, the two unions will band together again, but for the meantime, for the next 20 years, they're going to be separate competitors. In fact, the AFL-CIO still exists even today in 2018. So that's the development of the unions. Then you have strikes. Even with legal collective bargaining, companies still resisted unions. Strikes became more frequent during the Great Depression because, obviously there's a lot of tension over jobs and job security and wages now. So FDR is trying to get more power to unions, and there's a lot of pushback from companies against the New Deal, as well as these workers who get more rights. So there's for example, there's a very large strike in Flint, Michigan with the car shops or car factories there. Workers host a large sit-down strike where basically they walk into their company and all just sit down one day and work, and the factory doesn't operate because they'll just sit there and work and don't do anything. And so they all strike because their owners weren't allowing them to join a union. And so the government refused the request to send in troops. The car companies requested that they send in troops to deal with the problem, and the government refused to do so. So eventually in Flint, Michigan, they are allowed to join a union, but the organizers of the unions were eventually beaten and run off by some of the factory owners. There is also some smaller steel industries who resist too, that have some strikes in this time period. So some smaller steel industries also openly resist and go on strike as well. In May 1937, police will kill 4 in a picket demonstration. So May 1937, police will kill 4 people in a picket demonstration. And so by 1941, in the steel industry, they will finally allow people to organize in unions sometime later. So by 1941, you will see some allowance for organizing in unions at that time. So over time, obviously it takes some time, but unions are getting better treatment under the New Deal, under FDR, into the late 30s, into the 1940s. And then finally, you have the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act is the last piece of the New Deal. This is the last major act passed in the New Deal, passed in 1938. So this is basically even past kind of even like the second New Deal by this point. So this is the last major law passed by the New Deal. In 38, this act regulated businesses in interstate commerce. So the Fair Labor Standards Act regulated business and interstate commerce. And by the way, this act is still in force today. Like, this act is still around. But this act does a couple things. Number one, it creates a minimum wage. So now finally you have a permanent minimum wage, which will be 40 cents an hour. So as of 1938, you had minimum wage established, which will be 40 cents an hour. That will now will become permanent. Two, it creates a maximum work week of 40 hours a week. So now the Fair Labor Standards Act says that a maximum work week is 40 hours a week. Anything beyond that, you have to pay your worker time and a half, meaning that they get their wage plus half of it. So if you make $8 an hour, then anything over 40 hours a week would be $12 an hour, essentially. Let's see. 3, it also put restrictions on child labor. So anybody working under 16 years old will face penalties, essentially. So it also creates child labor laws, finally, that will stay on the books. The first child labor law since the one developed back in the 19-teens. So you also finally have some child labor restrictions with this act, too. The Supreme Court will also uphold this act later on in a court case called U.S. versus Darby Lumber Company. So this act is upheld by the Supreme Court, too. But it's important to understand that this act does lead to the maximum work week and minimum wage. And so the last phase of the New Deal, this is kind of like this is FDR's second term, because the second term of FDR, he doesn't exert as much power. He kind of hurts himself after he passes or tries to pass the court packing bill. When that happens, he kind of hurts himself because now Congress doesn't pass stuff that he wants as easily. And by his second term, FDR and the country are becoming more concerned about foreign affairs and what's happening in Europe and Japan and so forth. So let's talk about his second term in the last phase of the New Deal, the third phase, if you will. So there's a little minor recession within the Great Depression. In his first term, the economy showed signs of improvement. Banks stabilized, business earnings were moving up, unemployment was moving down to about 15%, which is better than 25%, but still not ideal. So in 1937, basically, FDR was pressured to turn off some of the spending on these programs, and so he does. And so he basically reduces some of the spending because it seemed like the economy was getting better. So they wanted to reduce some of the deficit spending. His own party and Republicans wanted him to do this, so he does. And so as a result, then, you have a bit of a minor recession, where you can kind of see it here on this chart somewhat, maybe. I don't know if you can see it or not, but you have peak unemployment at 25%, and then it's going down, and then in 1937, a recession hits, and it peaks back up around 20%. So because he turned some of the spending off, and the program stopped, the economy takes another downturn, where unemployment shoots back up to about 20%. Social Security Act had reduced consumer spending as well because it was a tax on people's income, and so that hurt some of their spending at the same time when this gets passed. And FDR was also pulling back money on relief programs and public work projects. So he was trying to finally reduce the national debt and balance the budget more, but obviously this doesn't work. So after a year or so of this happening, FDR would turn back on the spending and basically resume the level of programs that he had before this. And so what FDR decides to embrace is this idea called Keynesian economics. So FDR then embraces this concept called Keynesian economics. Called Keynesian economics after this British economist named John Maynard Keynes, spelled Keynes. So Keynes thought FDR made a mistake by trying to balance the budget. According to Keynes' theory, deficit spending was acceptable in difficult times by the government in order to initiate economic growth. So Keynes believed that this was okay to do economic growth. Deficit spending was okay during times of need. He called it priming the pump. But basically that you have to do deficit spending to get the economy back flowing again. So priming the pump would be used to create investments and job activity. FDR adopted the idea in 1938 with positive results. But no doubt about it, by 1937-38, the New Deal is now weakened. No boom really ever emerged. We never got out of the Great Depression under FDR, and the problems were maintained. After the court packing plan, Congress and the people didn't automatically side with FDR anymore, and Republicans and conservative Democrats began to block future New Deal programs, and they began to get more influence. Like in the 38 midterm elections, you're going to see Republicans actually regain some seats in Congress. Also, like I said, in his second term, more of the attention's turning to foreign affairs. So we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up there on Thursday with the notes.